Hello everyone and welcome to Psychopathology 2. Let me start by saying I'm sorry I made a mistake on the first lecture on Psychopathology 1. We're not going to be covering common treatments today. Now that's because as we're doing a real-world psychology module, rather than simply giving you a lot of information, I wanted you to have more opportunity to debate contemporary issues, so issues in the real world. So we're going to be looking at two different debates today, and those are blaming the addict and gendered depression. So we're going to start with covering the final two paradigms, the behavioural approach and the cognitive approach. And then you're going to use the knowledge that you've gained in the last two sessions to try and explain if, considering all that we know about psychopathology and its potential causes according to the paradigms, can an addict ever be blamed for their addiction? And then we're going to move on to discussing depression and why depression might be more prevalent in the female population. So, let's start with the behavioural approach. So, the assumptions of the behavioural approach are that all behaviour is learned from the environment, that psychology is a science and thus behaviour should be directly measurable and observable, and that behaviour is moderated by stimulus and response experiences and observations. So, let's start with the first assumption. Now, this is that all behaviour is learned from the environment. So, behaviourists believe that all children are born as blank slates, a tabula rasa. Now, what this means is that they have absolutely no information going into the world. Their internal experiences, so their physiological experience, is not relevant to their behaviour, so it totally ignores the biological approach, but instead that it's our experiences that mould who we are. So as children experience the world, the blank slate is slowly filled up and this shapes our behaviour. Typical and abnormal behaviour are thus dependent on experience. So, how do we gain these experiences and what influences our behaviour? That is the third assumption, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. The second assumption is that psychology is a science and thus behaviour should be directly measurable. So, they believe that their theories should be supported by objective data that is collected by practicing the scientific methods and directly observing behaviour. So, whereas with the psychodynamic approach, Freud theorized a lot of his work. He assumed that children go through these psychodynamic stages. With the behavioral approach, the thing that they base, or the data that they base their theories on, has to be directly measurable. So you have to be able to physically see it with your eyes. Oh no, it's not going forwards. There we go. In 1913, Watson stated that psychology, as a behaviourist views it, is purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is prediction and control. So it was very important to Watson that psychology as a science should be directly measurable. The components of the theory should therefore also be as simple as possible, utilising operational definitions. So essentially, the best explanation for behaviour is the most simple option, and that option should also be able to be viewed by an experimenter and tested using a scientific method. The final assumption is that behaviour is moderated by stimulus and response experiences. Now, I'm going to go through three different ways in which stimulus and response experiences can influence our behaviour. The first is classical conditioning. Now, what this means is that behavioural responses are conditioned through stimuli pairings. If any of you guys have read into Pavlov's dogs before, this is what classical conditioning is. So essentially, it is that we respond to things because we have previously associated that thing with them either being positive or negative. So we are either likely to repeat a behaviour if we think it's associated with something good, or avoid a behaviour if we think it's associated with something bad. The original study was Pavlov's dogs, and this is the image that we can see down here. So before conditioning, we have two stimuli. We have two stimulus. We have a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. Now, when they are consistently paired, so they are presented to a participant or to someone or something at the same time, that individual, that thing is then being conditioned. Now, that means that at the end of conditioning, so once they have been conditioned, they will respond to one stimulus as if the other stimulus was also present. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the bell being rung was a neutral stimulus. The dog heard a bell being rung and had no response to it other than whatever their typical response would be to a bell. They had also been fed, obviously. Now, the unconditioned stimulus was food. However, if researchers rang the bell and presented the food at the same time, the dog would associate these stimuli with each other, which means that the dog would associate the ringing of the bell with being fed. What researchers found was that after this conditioning process had been completed, the dog salivated, so responded in a way that you would expect with the food stimulus, when the previously neutral stimulus, the bell, was rung. So the dog had associated the bell with the food, which is therefore their conditioned response. Just to head back to that point, therefore, behaviour, according to the behaviourist approach, if classical conditioning has occurred, behaviour is the result of stimuli or stimulus, one stimulus being paired with another stimulus. Then we have operant conditioning, and this is slightly more simple. So this is where behavioural responses are conditioned due to reward and punishment. So, very simple. The core study here would be Skinner and his rats. So, rats are more likely to engage in a behaviour if it is associated with a reward. So, for example, they are more likely to press a lever if they then receive food. They are less likely to press a lever if they then are electrocuted. So, rewards are introduced to increase behaviour, and punishment is introduced to decrease behaviour. So that's pretty simple. Finally, we have social learning theory. So behaviour is the result of vicarious reinforcement or punishment and modelling. So what vicarious means is viewing someone else doing it, or sort of living through someone. So you are more likely to engage with a behaviour if you have seen someone else engage with that behaviour and be rewarded for it, than if you see someone else engage in that behaviour and they've been punished for it. The key study here is Bandura with his Bobo dolls. So children watched adults initially playing with a Bobo doll, and some of those children watched the adult behave very aggressively with the Bobo doll, punching it, kicking it, sort of beating it up, and then if the child was then allowed to play it with the Bobo doll, the child would then start hitting the doll, start being aggressive with the doll. So the children learned to engage with this behaviour because they had seen other people engage with that behaviour and have no negative repercussions. Children who hadn't seen that behaviour were not likely to engage in violent, aggressive behaviour against the doll. So, according to the behavioural approach in general, assuming that behaviour is moderated by stimulus and response experiences, we can see that pathological behaviour and abnormal behaviour, according to this theory, or according to the behavioural approach, would be associated with having been rewarded for engaging in pathological or abnormal behaviours, experiencing something else pleasurable whilst engaging in pathological behaviours, or seeing someone else be rewarded for engaging in pathological behaviours. The final approach we're going to discuss is the cognitive approach. Now, the cognitive approach was in response to the behavioural approach. Now, the behavioural approach assumed that everything that influences us can be visualized, can be seen, can be directly observed. However, cognitive psychologists believe that this was a very reductionist perspective, because behaviourists weren't considering what happened in the middle. What was it about, what was the interaction in the mind between viewing or experiencing something and then behaving in a certain way. They believe that behaviourists ignored this, so cognitive psychologists wanted to explore this. They were dissatisfied with the simplicity of the approach, and over the years between the behavioural approach and the cognitive approach being developed, there had also been developed better experimental measures. So technology had got better, which meant that we could explore things in different ways, and cognitive psychologists were therefore able to explore things cognitively. They also saw a comparison between the human processing and computer processing of information, and this made up a large basis for their assumptions. So, this is a visual sort of schematic or flowchart of the cognitive assumptions, the cognitive approach. But we'll move on to the assumptions. So, the first is that between stimulus and response are complex mental processes. The second is that psychology can be studied scientifically. And the third is that the workings of a computer and the human mind are alike. They both encode and store information and have outputs. Cognitive psychologists try to build up cognitive models of information processing that goes on inside people's heads, including perception, attention, language, memory, thinking, and consciousness. So, what we've already covered with the behavioural approach is that psychology should be studied scientifically. So this assumption is the same. They assume that you should be able to observe and understand. You should be able to explore someone's cognitions and be able to study those scientifically, the same way that behaviourists believe that everything should be able to be studied scientifically. But where we're finding psychopathology is in this first assumption, that there is somewhere between stimulus and response that is creating the psychopathology. So somewhere between observing or experiencing something and then behaving in a way, it is that place, that space between those two things, where psychopathology occurs and then influences behaviour. So, behaviourists rejected the idea of studying the mind because internal mental processes at the time could not be studied scientifically. However, cognitive psychologists believed that it was essential to examine mental processes and how these mental processes influence behaviour. Instead of the simple stimulus and response links proposed by behaviourism, the mediational processes, so what happens between that, are what's considered to be the most important to that says behaviourists, but it's meant to say cognitive psychologists. Without this understanding, psychologists cannot have a complete understanding of behaviour. So, with the behaviourist model, they assume that the area where psychopathology occurs is in the stimulus. So what happens in the environment to cause that behaviour? It is observing that behaviour, or it is observing that or experiencing that stimulus that causes psychopathology. However, with the cognitive model, they believe that it is the mediational process, so the mental events that occurs internally, where psychopathology actually occurs. And so that it is issues within our information processing that cause issues in our behaviour and mental health. So, the cognitive theory of depression is one such theory. One such explanation of psychopathology, and this was by Beck in 1976. Beck assumes that the cause of depression is when our schemas, so our internal scripts for how to act or what to expect from a situation, become negative automatic thoughts. So behaviourists, Beck in particular, believed that our behaviour was guided by schemas, and that these schemas guided our behaviour in the world. These are scripts of how to act and what to expect. However, if your schemas are negative, so if what you expect is negative and how you feel that something is going to be is negative, then you're going to experience a lot of negative emotions. So, these negative automatic thoughts are organised, according to Beck, in a negative triad, and if these become a faulty mediation between a stimulus, so a life experience, and a response, the behaviour, and this causes the subsequent behaviour to be depressive. So the input can be fairly typical, but the processing through the negative automatic thoughts is what creates the depressive behaviour. So, for example, if I were to send an email to a colleague and they sent me a very abrupt response back, a typical mentally healthy person might mediate that, might process that. Their schemas might process that as being because the person was busy, perhaps they didn't mean to be blunt, perhaps it hadn't occurred to them that their response might have been considered rude or a bit passive aggressive, and therefore that wouldn't affect your behaviour, you'd just let it go. However, if you have this negative automatic response, then your response might be to receiving a curt email, might be, well, you have the negative automatic thoughts of the world, so no one loves me. The negative automatic thoughts of the future, this person will never like me, and negative automatic thoughts of the self that this person doesn't like me because I am an ugly, worthless failure of a person, etc. So these inputs, this particularly neutral stimuli, goes into your mind and you process that, and then the output is depressive behaviour if it goes through this depressive cycle and comes out the other side as depressive behaviour. So that brings us to debate 1. I'd like you guys to spend about 20 to 30 minutes on each debate and give your response on the forums on Moodle. So the first debate is, can addicts ever be blamed for their behaviour? So consider the paradigms that I've discussed over the last 2 lectures. If behaviour is a result of our biology, our childhood, our faulty thinking, or our exposure to reinforcers, is it ever fair to blame an addict for their behaviour? Is it fair to assume that it's someone's fault if they can't be in control of their biology or what happened to them as a child? You might want to consider the strengths and limitations of each approach in your answer. So this is something that you might like to research to help formulate your answer in that 20 minutes to half an hour. I'm not expecting you to submit massive reams of work, just a short paragraph responding to the question. The second debate is why are women, or the second question, sorry, is why are women twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with major depression? Now, I provided a discussion sheet in the Moodle folder, so if you could read through this discussion sheet and then again take 20 to 30 minutes to consider how you would respond to this question and post your response in the associated forum. Depending on the amount of responses, I will provide feedback before the end of the week, hopefully, or by early next week. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys respond to this, and I will upload a video discussing your responses in relation to the lecture, or in relation to this online lecture early next week. So thank you guys for logging in, and I'll see you guys next year.